Story 1. Some memories don't thin out with time. They just get quieter, like a radio turned almost all the way down, still hissing in the corner. My name is Liam. I'm 33, a freelance cartographer out of Sacramento. Late May of 2016, I drove up to Yosemite on a weekday when Tioga Road had just reopened and the air still smelled like snow. I wanted a night alone near Tenaya Lake to ground truth a small project. Nothing glamorous, just stitching together GPS traces with the old USGS 7.5-minute quads. I like the work because it asks simple questions. Where is a thing? How do we know? It was one of those afternoons when the granite feels like it's holding in cold sunlight. Lodge poles stirred, needles clicked. I parked, shouldered a small pack, and took a faint use path skirting the lake's north side. I wasn't pushing into anything off limits, just wandering the gray seams between official lines. I had my handheld GPS, an old Silva compass, a notebook in a Ziploc, and a USGS map that someone else's hands had creased long before mine. I made small notes, spring seep here, boulder the size of a compact car there, and traced a neat breadcrumb of my progress. About a mile in, I cut through a line of trees and stepped into a clearing I didn't expect. It wasn't dramatic, 30 feet across, ringed by weather-bent shrubs and lumps of granite like elbows. The floor was swept clean, too clean, like someone had brushed the duff back in shallow arcs. A few flat stones made timid circles no more than 5 inches high. Not fire rings, not cairns. Arrangements. I thumbed the GPS and looked at the screen. The elevation contour on the paper map suggested the ground should fall away more than it did, as if the slope line had been nudged aside. It was only a few meters off, but that kind of thing bothers me. The map is a promise. I told myself the circles were nothing. People make marks where they feel something. I kept moving, pacing west until the trees opened on water, the color of tea where the lake crept into a shallow finger. The wind died near sunset, and the air sharpened to that metallic chill that sits just above freezing. I set up a tight little bivvy on a patch of sandy soil, low profile, gray fabric that blends. I ate by habit, a squeeze of peanut butter on a tortilla, a square of chocolate, a mouthful of cool lake water. I checked my lines, flicked my headlamp to low, and crawled in. At first it was the normal kind of quiet, the kind with shapes in it. The breeze passed through the needles above me in a slow ribbon. A fly that had found shelter in the bivvy tapped twice at the mesh, then gave up. I must have drifted off because when I woke the stars were crowded and the temperature had dipped hard enough that my breath felt heavy. I heard the faintest crunch, pine needles yielding under weight. It circled once, then again, pausing in those weird seams of silence where your brain reaches ahead of your ears. Deer move with caution, coyotes with intention. This sounded like both and neither, deliberate but irregular, as if someone was trying to remember how to step. I kept still. The sound passed behind the bivvy and stopped where my feet were, a polite distance away, then began again in a counterclockwise arc. It wasn't until the third circuit that I realized my weather radio, dead, wound down, was murmuring in my vestibule. Just a breath of static, moist and broken like someone whispering through a wet cloth. I hadn't touched it since the drive. I slid a hand out of the bag, found the headlamp, and pressed the button to bring it to a soft flood. The zipper of the bivvy shifted under its own weight. One tooth, two, and held. I can tell you the sound a good coil zipper makes when it moves without your hand. It clicks at the end of breath. Something else caught my light. My paper map lay on the ground sheet where I'd left it folded to the quadrant I was working. Only it wasn't exactly how I left it. It had a new crease. A neat, shallow fold ran right through the irregular contour line I'd been arguing with in my head. The fold closed the line, made the slope correct. I don't believe in omens. I believe in data. but the way a human hand had supposedly folded that map while I slept made the room inside my chest go very small. A glow reached around the edge of the bivvy wall, dull and steady, low enough to sit just above the ground, too even to be a headlamp. It didn't bob like a person. It lay on the trunks as if the wood had remembered being noon and decided to do it again. I thumbed off my light and listened hard. The steps finished their circle and stopped beside my pack. No sniff, no shift. Then, without sound, the glow moved. It slid a yard to the left of a trunk that, 5 minutes earlier, had been the kind of landmark you trust. The trunk now seemed half swallowed by shadow in a way that didn't match the sky. My teeth clicked, not from fear, but from the sudden cold. I waited until the slow ache in my legs overruled curiosity. When the small wind rose, I used it like a curtain to unzip and sit up. Night in the high country is a kind of black that tests you. I saw the clearing again, though I hadn't set up in it. The shallow stone circles were different. They were more than different. They were purpose. The rocks now formed a dotted line leading away from my bivvy toward a slab of granite that tilted like a frozen wave. The line stopped 2 feet before the lip. It felt like an invitation written in someone else's grammar. I packed in the dark, quick and practiced, fingers numb and clumsy. I left the rocks where they were and didn't bother with breakfast. I stepped wide of the line they made, wide of the slab, wide of anything with an edge. It wasn't running away. It was walking out of a room you suddenly discovered had more doors than walls. Dawn came like it always does, a thin silver first, then an earnest wash. On the way back toward the road, I looked once over my shoulder and saw nothing but decent trees and unremarkable granite with a history that pressed on without me. I made coffee on the tailgate, as if normal habits could sand down the corners. I drove home thinking about the fold in the map the whole way. Weeks later, sitting at my little table with a mug ring drawn into the wood, I pulled the GPS data into my computer to clean up the tracks. The Tenaya section was neat enough, good satellite lock, no spurious drift, but each point from that evening in the trees was stubbornly wrong in the same way. 11 meters, all to the east, as if the whole small world there had shifted one careful step while I slept. It didn't happen on the approach, and it didn't happen after. Only in the bowl of trees where the circles were. I keep that quadrant folded now. It lives in the bottom of a drawer. Sometimes when the house is quiet and the refrigerator hums just so, I can hear my weather radio make that damp little scrape from a shelf where it sits dead and unwound. I haven't opened the map to those coordinates since. I don't think the paper has forgotten. If there's a lesson, it's that some places allow being measured until they don't, and that a light with no source is not the part that should worry you. The part that should worry you is the small change a hand you don't see can make. I used to think a map was a promise. Now I think it's more like a question you have to keep asking. These days, when I pass the lake on the commute east, I keep my eyes on the center line and let the granite handle itself. The fold has outlived my curiosity. Between one campsite and the next, people keep finding the same 2 things. A low, steady glow where nothing should glow, and a whisper that sounds like electricity learning a new word. Some hikers take the long way around, others step right through it without a mark. Either way, the woods remember. Story 2. If I hadn't lived this, I'd roll my eyes at anyone who told it to me. I'm Ellie, Eleanor when the bills come in, 41, ER nurse in Knoxville, divorced 2 years, and sometimes the only way to empty my head is to go out where there are no walls. October 2019, peak color in the Smokies. The kind of wet, orange quiet that makes the world feel small and old. I took a Thursday off, signed out a backcountry permit near Cosby, and hiked to a little campsite tucked off a less loved trail. Nothing in me wanted company. I wanted a stream to tell me what time it was. It had rained 2 days straight, so the ground gave under my steps with that cold honey feel of soaked leaves. My pack was light, one-person tent, a cheap headlamp with batteries I trusted, the usual first aid odds and ends that get you through blisters and common sense. I hung my food like we all do there, rope over a high limb, bare bag tied off to a trunk with a clove hitch you learn to do without thinking. The stream sounded like a steady breath in a sleeping house. For a while, I just stood and listened, and something in my shoulders let go. Night came early under fog. My firewood was polite about not wanting to burn. I crouched and coaxed, laid the sticks like thin ribs, got a flame the size of a tea candle that turned the wood black without giving heat. Fine. I ate a cold dinner and sat with my back against the tree where the rope ran up to the bag. Once you've worked trauma, you learn to appreciate the good kinds of silence. The problem is when they start telling you they're not alone. At first, I thought it was hikers late to camp. That murmur you hear before faces appear on the switchbacks above you, loose conversation moving with effort. The trail ran a good ways over my sight, climbing in clean, predictable Z's. The voices stayed the same distance no matter how long I waited. I'm used to drift through fog, how sound slides in the wet, so I didn't pay it a full mind. Then they got instructional. Not words I could pick, just the rhythm of people telling someone else what to do. There was an impatience in it that put splinters under my nails. I told myself it was wind. Wind does that, especially in the Smokies where the coves hold air like soup. But when the breeze stilled, the murmur didn't thin out. It condensed. "You're not on the trail," one voice said, not loud, like a tired parent in a grocery aisle. I stood up without thinking, like I'd just been called. I flipped on my headlamp and followed the little path from my tent to where the main trail slanted above the stream. My light found the curve of mud climbing left, then right. I stepped onto it and saw my own prints from earlier, a size 7 tread I know like my own signature. 3 steps. Then, the same 3 steps again. Same heel scuff. Same little nick where the lug on my boot is worn. Again. The line of them climbed in loops, repeating like someone had traced and traced and traced a short section of real movement into a lesson. "Stay on the switchbacks," a voice said, closer now, behind a trunk so thin 3 of my fingers could hug it. I am not a brave person. I'm just good at staying in the room when someone needs me. I kept my light low and moved backward the way we were taught to when a patient is swinging. Calm, no sudden moves. The beam found little sparks of moisture on the leaves, and each one flashed just once, like a reluctant star. By the time I reached my camp, the fire I hadn't made was still a black outline on damp ground. My rope hung where I'd left it, only the line looked slack, like it had been unloaded. My bear bag lay on the ground, directly under the limb I'd thrown over. The knot at the tree was still snug, the rope still thrown high, and the bag itself was folded in perfect thirds, as if someone had been taught a neat way to put away a shirt and wanted me to be proud. I knelt and touched the fabric. It burned cold. Not cold night in the woods cold. Freezer cold. My breath left a brief fog in the headlamp beam and wavered like a curtain. Inside, everything wore the same refrigerated skin. The peanut butter was tight, as if it had been opened at altitude. The metal mug I keep nested inside the pot looked like it had been sitting under an air vent. It wasn't just the cold. It was the kind of chill that has a hum to it, like the first second when a dentist's office light clicks on. My little white noise app on my phone, which I never use outside but had for once because sleep had been so thin lately, tried to start itself. It played half a second of a damp hiss and quit. There's a fine line in the dark between should I leave and would leaving count as walking toward it. I got inside my tent because it was the only action that counted as staying. When I zipped up, the sound from the switchbacks slid down into the stream bed and pooled there, like the words were heavier than the air they'd been riding. The voice that had called me stepped around the thin trunk and stood just this side of the tent wall, which is to say it never showed itself. "Stay on the switchbacks," it said again, like a reminder you pretend is for someone else. The fog thickened the way fog does, suddenly and then more. Drops formed on the inside of my fly, aligned in lines that didn't match gravity. They formed parallel slashes that leaned toward the tent door, and where the two lines crossed, they made a neat little arrow that pointed at the zipper. I focused on the small, practical things. My breathing, 4 in, 6 out. The square of fabric where my fingers could press and feel how close the outside was. Out there, a lantern moved low across the trail without getting closer or farther. It made a path of almost light, a tide line of someone is over there. It never rose, never dipped. It just slid, slow as patience. I sat awake until the stream began to sound like morning. The voices climbed back up the switchbacks and thinned into the trees. When the first gray came, I climbed out and stretched the stiffness out of my back. I checked the rope and the limb and the fact that the universe still allowed objects to remain where they'd been. Then I saw them. Little flags the color of traffic cones. Orange ribbons tied around shrubs and saplings just off my campsite, making a neat, practical trail where no trail belonged. Each ribbon pointed to the next. They led toward a cut in the trees I hadn't noticed, a plausible shortcut that ran parallel to the switchbacks for a short way, and then out of sight. I'm not the kind of person who follows ribbon into fog. I broke camp quick and neat, hands efficient the way they are when you turn over a patient's room because there's still a family to face afterward. On the walk out, every switchback felt like I was reciting a verse I had to get right. Somewhere above, the same lantern slid low between trunks without caring where I was. It never got to the junction. It never disappeared. It just turned and turned, like someone practicing a figure 8. 2 nights later, back in my apartment, the city quiet felt fake. I put on my white noise machine for the first time in months, hoping the bland ocean would sand me down. It crackled to life with a wet static and a faint rhythm that shouldn't have been there. Crunch, crunch, like footsteps pressing into leaves that didn't exist between my walls. I turned it off, and the silence got teeth. I don't tell this at work. The ER runs on stories, but we like them to have edges we can feel. I don't take shortcuts on trails anymore, and I can't stand the way long hospital corridors bend back and forth under fluorescent hum. It's not that I'm afraid of getting lost. It's that I'm no longer sure there isn't something patient waiting on the other side of every turn, instructing in a voice I'll always hear. The switchbacks are still there, and I stay on them because I've been told to. If I ever forget, I think the woods will remind me. Story 3. Some nights don't start dark. They start hollow, like the world has been scooped out and you can hear how thin it is when the wind moves through. I'm Marco, 57 now. Was a mechanic for the Border Patrol out of Alpine, Texas, back when I still set an alarm. March 2012, Big Bend, a moonless stretch near the dry lip of the Rio Grande, where the river is more memory than water. I went because the silence out there isn't the city's idea of quiet. It's the real kind, with grit in it, mineral and honest. I parked at the end of a dirt road lacquered with caliche and walked a short way to where the riverbed opened like a road no one uses anymore. Mesquite, ocotillo, the odd prickly pear, everything holding its place like a stubborn old man. I set my tent low among the rocks and brushed off a flat spot with the edge of my boot. The day had been warm in that way the desert likes to pretend it's forgiven you for winter. When the sun dropped, the heat left cleanly, a pulled tablecloth, and the air snapped to cool with a taste like wet pennies. Routine makes me feel safe, or whatever passes for safe once you've seen enough human mess. Stakes angled away from the pull, lines snug but not cruel, water jugs upright with their caps checked twice. I ate a simple dinner, rice, beans, the kind of food that waits for you without complaint, and sat with my back against the tent, listening to a long silence stitched together with small sounds. A moth blundering into nylon, a pebble shifting, the thin tick of cooling metal somewhere inside the truck even from this distance. The stars were violent good, their light an old, slow fire. At first it was just a wrongness you feel more than see. The riverbed, a gray ribbon under the sky, carried a faint glow along its spine. It wasn't a light in the way I know lights. It didn't have a source or throw a cone. It sat low like a baseball-sized fog, steady and polite. Too steady for a headlamp, too fixed for a truck moving along a far road. It braced itself against the dark, patient. Where it touched the air felt cooler, but the breeze didn't change. I don't spook easy. I've walked up on people sleeping where they shouldn't, on things people throw away when they think no one is looking. I reached into my tent for my old phone, thinking maybe I'd record something, even if the camera would only get blackness. The microphone woke up and offered me a sound like a quiet breath pulled through a radio that had been left in the rain. It wasn't wind. It wasn't the little bugs that make electricity out of being alive. It was a soft electric exhale that made the space behind my teeth feel crowded. I tried to talk myself through it like I would through a stubborn bolt. Identify, assess, adjust. The glow didn't care about my list. It shifted a foot to the left, as if it had thought better of where it had been. The bushes didn't get brighter or darker. Shadows didn't lean toward it like they should. Instead, something else happened. The light split, just for a heartbeat, a twin copying itself. And in that blink, all the shadows around me reversed, like someone had flipped the desert over and I was looking at its underside. My breath stalled. The zipper on my sleeping bag went cold in an instant, so cold I let go like I'd been burned. My canteen, warm from the day, made a sound like a soda can opening underwater. Tiny bubbles complaining under a surface that hadn't moved. You can tell a lot from how your hands work when you're scared. Mine stayed practical. I zipped the bag halfway up to trap some heat, checked the stakes again with the side of my heel, and settled on my haunches outside the tent facing the riverbed. The light, if you could call it that, came together again as if the division had been a hiccup. It started to move, not toward me, not away, but along the dry channel in a path that matched the memory of the river when it had been full. It traced a shallow S-curve between big stones like it remembered them from another map. I stood and followed at a distance because I couldn't think of a better idea. The sand under my boots made small, shamed sounds. A few yards from where I'd pitched, the bed went wide and the glow paused in the middle like it had come to a threshold it respected. I was 15 feet away and I noticed something that made the hair along my arms rise like a chola. The topography didn't line up with what my eyes knew. The far bank seemed closer than it should have, like the world had pocketed 3 steps without telling me. I cupped my hands around my eyes to make a tunnel and looked along the plain where ground meets sky. The line stuttered, like 2 transparencies a little out of register. A wind slid by, carrying the scent of old mud and warm stone. In it, I heard small snaps, like someone crumpling cellophane slowly. The old radio in my head sighed. I could taste metal. The glow eased forward until it reached the place where, years ago, a drowned limb had planted itself in flood and become part of the scene. The limb wasn't there. Instead, a shadow of the shape of it lay on the sand, perfect and clean, like a chalk outline with no body. The light sat above the absence and held. My phone's screen stayed black, but the timer ticked. 28 seconds, 29. I don't remember deciding to kneel, but my knee found the sand and it was colder than the air. In the corner of my eye, I saw my own shadow point the wrong way for a blink, a quick betrayal like a friend lying about something small. I whispered something useless, maybe a prayer, maybe a mechanic's swear with the corners sanded off, and the glow blinked out. Not like a switch, like a breath held too long. I stood up fast. The dark swelled. Behind me, the tent sighed like a sleeping animal, and the little rocks I'd moved earlier settled back, as if embarrassed at having been handled. I turned my headlamp on low and walked back the way I'd come, countable steps, each one placed where I could remember placing the last. In the cone of light, a line of footprints curled away from my camp like a pet that had circled for a spot that never felt right. The soles were mine. Same tread chewed out on the left, same toe drag from an old knee, but the orientation was wrong. They were my steps, but they faced me. The pattern said I had been walking backward without bending, like a film spooled in reverse. Morning built itself out of gray and then color the way it always does. The wind went gentle. The desert, which had kept its face tight all night like a stubborn secret, relaxed. The light didn't come back, and the dry river was only a road again. I looked for the drowned limb and found instead a different piece of wood that could have been it if I'd been hungry enough for a match. I kicked at the sand and the imprints of my boots weakened into honest scuffs, obeying gravity like they'd signed a contract. Back in Alpine, a late spring thunderstorm took the power down for an hour. The emergency lights in the apartment hallway blinked into life with that specific little hiccup fluorescents have when they're nervous. A low, patient pulsing filled the new dim as if the building had a pulse and wanted us all to know. It was the same slow breath the phone had caught out there by the dry river. The same moist static alive in the wrong places. My neighbors complained about the noise when I mentioned it. They said the lights were quiet. I told them I sleep fine when the whole place hums like a refrigerator. I lied. I don't sleep on blackout nights anymore. I go back to Big Bend sometimes. It's not a thing I'm afraid of. Fear is a tool. You use it to point you away from cliffs. This is something else. It's a correction. The kind you feel when the world taps a carpenter's square against your edges and finds you half an inch off. I carry a map I don't need, and I trust my feet more than my eyes. When the wind shifts and carries the smell of wet metal over dust, I sit down and give the night my full attention. And I watch the river that isn't there breathe in, breathe out, as if it's practicing for when it returns. I tell myself the glow belonged to water rehearsing its route. I tell myself that because I'm running out of other things. But some evenings, when the lights in the hallway tremble and I hear that soft, electrical exhale, I stand very still and wait for it to pass. It doesn't feel over just because the desert pretended to forget. Story 4. If I hadn't checked my metadata, I'd swear I made some of it up after the fact, but cameras are honest even when you aren't. I'm Dana, 29 by the calendar I was ignoring then, adjunct photo instructor out of Portland, Maine. June 2021, late thaw, fog off the Atlantic moving through Acadia in long curtains. I had a backcountry permit for a coastal site where a strip of rock shows itself at low tide like an old scar. My plan was 12 exposures of the night sky, long and patient, to talk to my students about time and how you can show it without a clock. The air was a taste, salt sweet from kelp, cold in a way that takes your breath politely instead of stealing it. Buoy bells out beyond the curve of coast kept their little metronomes. A gull somewhere complained once, as if for the record, and then gave up. I set the tent a respectful distance above the high tide line, checked my coordinates like a person who's been scolded by a ranger before, and laid out my tripod where the sand turned to weed-slick rock. I teach people that the first 15 minutes on location is all ears and nose. What you smell and what you hear matters as much as what you see. The ocean runs a pulse through the ground. You can feel it in your ankles if you let your knees go soft. I set the camera, a sturdy old workhorse, on a 30-second exposure, secured the remote and took a breath that felt like a small, clean coin on my tongue. The fog made the light from my headlamp less than mine, like it wanted me to share. I switched it off and let my eyes adjust. At the edge where the dark water became the darker rock, small lights woke and held. They sat like someone had pushed thumbtacks into the tide line, 10 or 12 of them, cool and indifferent. Not fireflies. These were steady as decided things. I told myself it was a bioluminescent slick caught just right. I opened the shutter for the first frame, counting quietly, feeling the sound of the buoy sew itself through the gap with a neat, measured stitch. When I reviewed the image on the back of the camera, I saw the stars and the patient lines the planet makes when you let it. And I saw, standing thin and tall between two boulders, a shape that hadn't been there a second earlier. A narrow stripe of absence, high and straight like a post. But when I looked up, there was nothing to cast it. No lighthouse beam sweeping, no mast vaguely visible. Just the fog making shapes out of its own hunger. The second exposure opened, then the third, then the fourth. The little lights along the tide kept their places. The bells in the bay were not wrong exactly. Slower, then fast, then erratic, like someone had moved one a yard to the left, and the current didn't like it. I heard the water licking closer than it should have been, not louder but nearer, like the tide was inhaling but not exhaling. Behind me, the tent made tiny popping sounds as the mist beaded and moved, little snaps in a rhythm that wasn't mine. My audio recorder, a reliable little thing that has suffered undergraduates and stupid weather, captured a strand of sound that I didn't hear with my ears until I played it back weeks later. A low collective tone like voices hummed backward, the vowels clogged with salt. I'd set it to catch the bell cadence, to show students how time lives in sound, too. The file labeled itself with a timestamp that ran clean from 1 to 3 a.m., and still left me feeling like there were missing beats. Teachers live in little missing beats. Little. midnight, the fog shaved down to a gauze. I walked the wet sand to keep warm and to keep from staring at the static ring of lights like a hypnotist's watch. There, in the sheen where the ocean's last pass had left the beach, I found a trail of prints, not deep like they should be with weight, shallow and precise, each one the same as the last, like a mold pressed by a careful hand. They made a wide arc around where I'd set up, considerate, like a stranger giving a smoker extra space. And then, a yard in front of my own freshest step, they closed, toe to toe with mine, neat as a handshake I hadn't offered. My mouth went dry in a salty, bitter way. I raised my camera because that's what I do when I don't know what else to do and pressed the remote. In that long second between opening and closing, the lights at the tide line all went out at once. The buoys, as if they had been told to pause, stopped talking. The absence was the precise length of 3 breaths, a new measure. And when the bells came back, they were not quite the right bell, like someone had retuned the ocean by a scent and walked away. I walked back to the tent like it was the only thing that had been invited here with me. Inside, where the condensation had been collecting, droplets arranged themselves in clean parallel runnels, all leaning toward the door zipper. They refused the gravity of the wall and obeyed something else's instruction. Old student trick. If you flip on your headlamp in a mirror flat beam and move it side to side, you can watch water think. I watched it point. When I finally lay down, the fabric made a quiet sound like a radio far away trying to remember your name. Sleep wasn't happening. So I waited, counting long inhalations, my hands flat on my stomach to feel if the sea's pulse would come through. The fog thinned again near 4, and a breeze moved in from a direction the forecast hadn't promised. Something in its edge made the fine hair on my forearms take notice. I stepped out, and the line where wet becomes dry seemed to have shifted farther up the beach than the tide chart would allow, as if the ocean had reached and then hesitated, embarrassed. In the gray where you convince yourself you're practical, Everything becomes a choice you pretend is small. I chose to pack, not a rush, not a flee. A pack with respect for everything that had bothered to exist around me. I broke down the tripod, laid the camera in its case like a fragile bird, and rolled the tent with a little extra care at the zipper. The first blue appeared behind the fog, and the bells settled back into their expected measure. By the time I cinched the last strap on my pack, the sand had taken my prints and made them less specific, democratic. The lights did not come on again. I walked out on a path that had a few too many turns for such short distance. A path that made me feel like I was being shepherded toward an exit someone else had planned. In my apartment, between laundry and a sink full of monotonous dishes, I pulled the raw files into the computer because truth is easier to face when you have something to click. Frame 8 showed a tide line wet farther up than it had ever gotten, the sheen clean as if the ocean had caught its breath and stepped in one last time. I checked the data, every timestamp, every ISO, every shutter. The numbers behaved. They were good students who had studied. I printed the frame anyway and stared until the white of the paper looked dirty. When I taught the following week, I used the set as an example of how long exposure can gather what the eye can't. I clicked to frame 5, and a hand in the second row went up. "What's that line right there?" the student asked. "What line?" I said, tired, reflex. "The straight one, like a laser. Right across the middle." The class murmured softly. It wasn't the "we're bored" sound. It was the "we can't agree on reality" sound. I leaned in. The screen showed me a sky with star trails and a horizon that should have been boring. The line wasn't there. They saw it. I didn't. 2 days later, in a different section, a different student found it in a different frame. The humidity in the room had crept up that day, and the wall-mounted dehumidifier stuttered and clicked like a small thing learning to speak. I ended class early. There's a studio light that lives in our equipment closet that I unplug every time I walk by it, whether it's on or not. It's not superstition. It's a ritual. My hands know what to do even when my head is loud. On fog days, I run a thumb along the zipper of whatever I'm wearing to feel if it's warmer than it should be. When I take students out to the coast now, I don't lecture as much. I have them stand and listen to the bell cadence for 5 full minutes before they uncap a lens. I want them to know what time is supposed to sound like before it changes. If you press me, and students do, because they're built to press, I'll tell you this is probably a trick of wet air and nerves, an artifact of long exposure stacked with a brain that wants a story. I'm a teacher. I believe in explanations that make a person feel like they can keep going. But on nights when the city fog rolls in and the streetlight outside my window glows a little lower than the rest, I turn off everything electric and sit still. I wait to see if the room will pick a pulse that doesn't belong to me. It's not belief, it's accommodation. Since that night, I do my best work in dry weather, and when the bell in my memory takes 3 long breaths before it speaks again, I don't argue with it. I just listen to what it thinks the tide line should be, and I let that be the lesson I can't put on a syllabus.